After nearly 200 hours of Baldur's Gate 3, I finally feel, if not qualified, then at least experienced enough with the game to offer an informed opinion and a detailed review. In my first impressions, I said that the game's beautiful graphics, detailed animations, and imaginative presentation wowed me. One of the big questions then for this full review is, does that visual polish continue right through to the end of the game? Thankfully, yes. Barring the occasional glitch, mainly in cutscenes where the camera angle or lighting can be off, the late game's locations and characters are as visually appealing as those found in Act 1. Actually, the game's final region, final in quotes, because it's just the last area that is a fully explorable environment before the final battle, is definitely the standout area for me. Baldur's Gate's lower city is a bit overwhelming, to be honest. This being the late game location, I was expecting things to be more linear, focusing in on that main quest line, but actually things broaden up in the lower city, and I found there were more options here than anywhere else in Acts 1 and 2. Usually I don't mention a game's music or sound this early in a review, but after several songs I heard in the lower city for the first time and come as such a wonderful surprise, I thought I'd cover it now. They're proper songs as well, these ones that I'm thinking about, sung sometimes by the characters that you've encountered. They're actually singing a song to you as you battle them. I'm going to try and avoid spoilers as much as I can in this review, but some are inevitable. So now you know there's a battle at some point with a character who will sing to you. Well, I'm sorry about that, but it's so good I've got to mention it. It really stood out to me as a fantastic flourish, and the fact they've held it back until Act 3, something like that. Maybe it's the game dev equivalent of a flex, I don't know. The excellent sound design starts much earlier than this, however, with spells sounding suitably impactful, each cast with a dramatic shout. Weapons feel meaty, all the more remarkable since this is a turn-based CRPG. The clash of metal on metal is always satisfying. A personal favourite of mine is the shield bash that one of my characters could use as a reaction, so you get hammered only to rally and slam your shield back into the enemy, knock them off the ground with a satisfying clang and a thud. That never gets old. Combat music in these games is usually fairly perfunctory, but Larian finds a way to spice things up. When one of your characters kills an enemy, it switches to this more heroic mode, as if the question mark on whether you can win a certain encounter has been answered. It's great stuff, and the fact it stands out to someone like me who kind of just... game music has to be good for me to really notice. Most stuff is fairly middle of the road, but this is really good. I need to take my foot off the pedal a little bit though, stop gushing, really think about the things people want from RPGs, character customization for instance. Can you truly create the kind of party you want in Baldur's Gate 3? Sort of. The options for your main character are plentiful, visual options, tons of classes and subclasses. There's so many options I didn't even realise you could dual class until I watched a VOD. It's not hidden, it's just not presented like it's anything special. It's like, oh yeah, you can dual class, whatever. Honestly, I haven't even scratched the surface in that regard. The way I see it, you've got to know a class from level 1 to 12 before you can effectively start blending them. But for D&D veterans, I'm sure it's exactly what they want, allowing them to reproduce meta builds that they've come up with from thousands of hours playing the pen and paper game. Choices for your party are more limited, however. Having fully voiced companions with intricate stories means that these will be the guys accompanying you whether you like it or not. You can change Astarion, for instance, to be a paladin, but that doesn't make sense for his character, and obviously his story will no longer fit that character class. I did respec Shadowheart to be a full cleric, but that change does sort of make sense. Again, spoilers, but there are some choices you can make in the game there where that makes sense. You're offered the option to have non-voiced followers, but Larian being Larian, they're unable to be totally hands-off in this regard. They give these characters mini backstories, and although you can respect the professions, their race and look remains locked. So if the option for fully customizable party members isn't in a patch soon, I'm sure there's already a mod that will allow you to do it, because all the structure is there. The the system is there for doing it. They've just chosen not to give you complete freedom beyond your own main character, but it's all there, so I'm sure modders will take care of it. Weird really, because choice is paramount in almost every other aspect of the game. All the more incredible given the amount of voice acting, animation, and the sheer production cost involved in accounting for all the little decisions a player could possibly make. I really had to recondition my brain because I didn't understand the scope. Usually in these games there are NPCs you talk to and there are camps of enemies. In Baldur's Gate 3 you always have the option to wander up to anyone and talk to them. The game is really just full of factions, and they can be good or bad, but you can ally with them, treat them as enemies. So the first zone that you enter with those stereotypical good guys, it's a druids hang out there and some civilians, that could be the dungeon, and you could choose to ally with the nearby goblin camp. It's totally doable in this game. It really hit home for me when I saw a group of ogres and I did what I'd been conditioned to do, find a good spot to set an ambush. Only afterwards, reading the diaries that the ogres had on their bodies, did I realise that that fight was not necessary at all. In fact, if I talked to them and the conversation had gone well, I might have secured a powerful ally. Small encounters like these have the option, but surely not the big decisions regarding major NPCs. Wrong again. You have total freedom here, and the major story points can be completely different depending upon the choices you make. Ultimately, however, the game's story is what you might expect from a game of this type, a godlike entity that must be thwarted, but BG3 does a better job than most of providing intrigue. First, the player is infected by a parasite, so the need for a cure takes precedence. Then later, the motivations of various parties involved with that overarching plot. That becomes the focus. Repeatedly, the game employs the narrative technique of foreshadowing, mentioning characters or locations that you will eventually encounter. It's very effective, building anticipation and making those encounters all the more impactful. Although there can also be a sense of anticlimax, because eventually those stories and tales of this scourge of the Sword Coast has to be reduced to game mechanics, and you're fighting a level 8 fighter with a couple of unique abilities, but certainly nothing special. So it's almost like they can never live up to the hype that the game presents them with. So it's a little bit like a horror movie. As soon as you see the monster, it's never as scary as the anticipation of the monster, you know. Mentioning the amount of choice you have in the narrative does lead me to my first gripe with the game, however. Certain decisions can have serious consequences before you really understand what's going on in a region or with certain characters. In the worst case, a bug can occur. Again, I mentioned in my first impressions how I'd arrived at the Druid Enclave near the start of the game and the two opposing factions broke out into open conflict. Now I'm certain that was a bug, knowing the game as I do, because it's something that can happen but much later after you've made certain choices. For some reason the game's logic thought we were at that point, me having only just arrived, so it was a total bug. But not always. Something similar did happen just as a result of the order in which I spoke to people. Another settlement I came across, pivotal to the story, got wiped out within minutes of my arrival. So before I was even able to get a sense of that place, what was going on, everyone was dead. I was unable to complete a major companion quest because of this, and another quest line concerning the fate of the entire region. On that occasion I thought, well, I'm pretty sure this isn't a bug. It's just the order in which I did things. A fight broke out, it's the way the fight went, so I'm going to live with it, kind of embracing the RPG spirit of playing a game like this. But it was very frustrating, to say the least. Continuing that theme of the game getting confused by its own complexity, none of the romance scenes between my character and Shadowheart played. Although by the end she was convinced we were in a loving relationship. I had no idea about this because whatever she did to me, she did it while I was asleep. On the whole, I understand it's an incredibly complex game and bugs are inevitable, and I will definitely be playing through again multiple times, so I will experience all the options eventually. But I felt the game robbed me on several occasions, and if the rest of the game weren't so good, it might have left a very poor taste in my mouth. Although that might have been Shadowheart, I wouldn't know. A lot has been said about the level of polish in Baldur's Gate 3 after 4 years of early access, and it generally is very solid, but it's by no means bug-free, even after several patches. stuff is still cropping up, or without its problems in terms of the way the game is put together. I'm going to keep on this slightly negative track for a while since we've arrived at this place, and in case you're in any doubt at this stage, I would say that Baldur's Gate 3 is the best, certainly the best CRPG I have ever played, possibly the best RPG, computer RPG on any system ever that I've played. But it's not perfect. All the way through, I felt I was fighting with the game's UI and inventory. Half the time when I clicked on a character's portrait, it didn't register, meaning I had to click twice, and the method for grouping characters by dragging their portraits is janky and not very intuitive. It also didn't persist for me between regions or reloads, so eventually I just ended up letting the game decide what order my party is going to be in, because it kept switching them around. There are some oversights and they're small things in the very grand scheme, but it's just an example of how if you go in, because games can get overhyped, there are the usual annoyances that there are in any game. One of them, for instance, in this game is the fact that when you use a scroll from the inventory, some spells have certain things that you can choose in terms of how they are cast. Well, the submenu for that doesn't open if you use the scroll from inventory. You have to drag it to your hotbar for that to work. But the very worst part of the game, for me, is your inventory. How it works, how you move things around. There is no communal space for your items, so you're constantly having to shuttle things between party members, keep track of who has what. It's needless busy work. A communal space for your items is so much simpler. There's the travel chest in your camp, but of course you have to go back to that to sort through your gear, and it's one of the most annoying windows, a stupid narrow window. Windows and inventory. I suspect a big reason why it's like this is because of the multiplayer. When you can play with friends, everyone needs to manage their own inventory, but when you're solo and you have 4 characters to manage, communal inventory is just such a better solution, and almost every other CRPG I've played in modern times has had that. Certain things are meant to help with this, but they only half work. Each character has an alchemy bag, for instance, but half the time the suitable items don't go into that bag automatically, so you have to go into your inventory, manually drag them to the bag. It cuts out on clutter, but why don't they automatically go into that bag? I could go on, but suffice to say, the inventory really did my head in all the way through, and to the point at which I was avoiding looting corpses. They'll just have junk anyway, and because I'll have to sort it who gets what out of the corpse, I was just leaving them alone, having enough money at that point. So yeah, but it's just a shame, and it really spoilt things. If I'm honest, I did feel like it was a constant battle. Anyway, annoying the item management maybe, but finding those rarer objects is an absolute delight. Generally speaking, most of the very rare or legendary gear, it's all hidden behind these puzzles, and this is where the game feels most like a D&D adventure to me, prepared by an expert dungeon master who's really thought through the scenario and the locations and the dungeons you're going to explore. Oftentimes there's no quest associated with these items. You just get a hint of something from an NPC or a diary entry or something odd in the environment that one of your companions spots. One of the highlights of my playthrough was figuring out how to get this particular legendary weapon. It involved a series of puzzles, and the final step of the puzzle, you really had to think laterally about it. We got it, and I gave it to Shadowheart, and then she carried it all through the rest of the game. We never found anything that was better, proving that if you put the time in and you think things through and get a little bit creative with problem solving, you will be rewarded, and the item that you got is not going to be obsolete as soon as you move on to the next zone. One of my biggest disappointments on the other side was my main was a wizard, so I was obviously really looking forward to visiting this mecca for wizards that is in Baldur's Gate City itself, known throughout Faerun, but I simply could not figure out the final step to get the really, really good loot that was hidden there. After 12 hours of trying, I eventually googled it, and then I spent the rest of the night kicking myself because the solution was right there. I just had to think a little bit laterally and I would have got it. The game kind of prods you towards thinking in ways that most games don't, and I was just thinking, there's a switch I've missed, there's something in the environment that's not pinging, maybe it's even a bug. and know the solution was there. You just had to trust the game and be a bit creative and you would have found it. Kicking myself that I had to Google it. Anyway, really brilliant stuff that makes the game feel so rewarding. The good treasure makes a big difference too. On balanced difficulty, I did that for my main playthrough. So there's the easy, it's basically easy, medium, difficult. I don't know why they don't call them. Well, I do, because they don't want, no one's going to want to play on easy. They want to play on something called story, appreciate the story, but it's easy mode. So balanced is in the middle and then you have a hard one. But on that difficulty, the balanced difficulty, fully geared characters can be absolute powerhouses, meaning that even the most powerful demons, you're pretty sure you can tackle them. There's usually a trick in those big boss fights, a ritual that you need to disrupt, or a timer that you have to be aware of. If you don't do it in time, things go to pot. But once you've sussed all that out, you're usually guaranteed a win in the later stages of the game when you're so powerful. Shadowheart was the core of my group. She had ridiculously high AP, tons of healing. She was able to revive everyone, so as long as she was still alive, we could walk it. Much has been said about the myriad options in combat. I agree, and it's a great laugh exploring options in the environment for throwing candles on oil slicks and things like that, but it's only really true for the first part of the game. Once you've got such powerful abilities, mucking about setting fire to those oil slicks or throwing chairs, it doesn't make much sense. You just do it for fun. It's not actually useful anymore. Although the one caveat I would say that is that flinging people off ledges, that's always useful right through to the end of the game. Larian have said that modelling D&D's levelling beyond 12 would be difficult given the kinds of abilities you end up with in D&D, and I can totally see that. Having reached level 12 in Baldur's Gate 3, you already feel totally overpowered. There's this big deal in the final act about securing the support of allies. You spend a lot of time garnering that support and doing these quests so they'll aid you in the final battle, but I found I didn't need to call on anyone for that final battle. I actually forgot about the option entirely, and some of them are flipping immortals, just weren't needed. Resources are limited. You can only rage so many times, cast so many spells, but healing potions, poisons, and other items are plentiful. You can carry hundreds of scrolls as a wizard for when you've run out of spell slots, and since I never really found myself short on cash, there was very little point in devoting time to the game's needlessly obtuse alchemy system. It's not difficult to understand, it's just annoying to work with. It obfuscates things, so it makes what should be the straightforward process of mixing two ingredients together really complicated for no reason. You have to refine them into essences and stuff like that. We don't know why exactly. I'm just thinking maybe we need to make this seem complicated, but it really isn't. It's just annoying, particularly when you have all the cash you need to buy all the potions. After playing for such a long time, and I'm pretty sure this is the longest initial playthrough of any game I've ever played, I feel drained, but also elated. Drained because that's one hell of a long time to spend playing any game, and I could have finished earlier, but I wanted to discover as much as I could, talk to as many NPCs as I could. That's something I did want to mention actually, how talking to NPCs, it's always pleasant. I usually find myself skipping a lot of dialogue in RPGs. Predictability is a key factor in whether I choose to do that, but both companions and NPCs were genuinely intriguing throughout the game, and talking to animals, that's always wonderful. It's a primal urge present in myths and fairy tales. From the dawn of time, humans learning how to commune, having the magical ability to commune with animals, and it always feels special. Only towards the very end, when I knew where the story was going and things were wrapping up, did I start to rush through some of the more predictable exchanges and performances that seemed a little bit laboured when you kind of know what needs to happen and what's going on. So yeah, a little drained, but also elated because I had so many new experiences in this game. Baldur's Gate 3 found ways to surprise me throughout. The scope and intricacy of its environments, the depth of the combat, the cleverness of the puzzles, the way you're rewarded for being curious. The only big downside for me is the lack of options in terms of your party makeup that I mentioned earlier. Further playthroughs are bound to feel weird when you have this camp of followers whom you never talk to because you've got your you've got the party you want. I definitely need a break, but I'm going to go back and go through with a party of 4 halflings, or try to recreate the stereotypical adventuring party from board games like Hero Quest. Warrior, Wizard, Elf, Dwarf. I'm so happy that this genre that I've loved all my life is getting the kudos it deserves from a wider audience, and I wonder what that means for the future. Will we see big budget copycats, and what will Larian do next? Whatever they do, it's going to be years in the making, so hopefully they'll be adding new features to Baldur's Gate 3 in the meantime, and maybe even DLC, who knows. If you enjoyed this video, then please do me a solid and like it. More people watch my vids than sub, probably because I'm covering a lot of different games, so if you could sub too, that'd be great. I can't promise to always talk about the games you're interested in, but I can promise that my vids will always be well produced and thoughtful examinations of games, both old and new. Thanks for watching. I've been Napyet, and I'll see you next time.